Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. There is so much to talk about today. Just before we went live, a massive news that explosions have been heard over Doha amid reports of Iran launching missiles towards US air bases in Qatar. Obviously, this seems like the retaliation from Iran for America's bombing of their country late on Saturday night. I'm going to be speaking to Paul Rogers. He's a regular on the show, always brilliant at making sense of fast-changing news. So brilliant we had him booked on for tonight. So much to talk about. In the second half of the show, I'm going to be joined by Ash Sarkar, and we'll, of course, be talking about the prescription of Palestine Action. And we are, I suppose, going to end with some analysis of the topsy-turvy world we're all living in when we're being told that Iran must return to the negotiating table, when what has happened, in fact, is that Iran has repeatedly been at the negotiating table and then either had deals ripped up by the likes of Donald Trump or been bombed by the likes of Netanyahu and now Donald Trump. As I say, so much to get into. Before we do that, though, for the past week, you guys have been deciding where our fundraiser lands. We didn't give you any targets or limits, and we're so grateful that an extra 300 of you have chosen to back our work at such a crucial time. And we've been working around the clock on Novara Live to deliver the honest coverage and fact-based analysis needed to make sense of the rapidly evolving situation in the Middle East this past week. This quality and quantity of content is only possible thanks to our supporters. So thank you to everyone who has signed up. And today is the final day of our 7-day call out. So if you value Novara's coverage, please do consider signing up to support our work. And this can be anything from £1 per month. It really does make such a huge impact. So if you would like to support our work, go to novaramedia.com/support. If you're one of the 1,300 people who have newly signed up in the past couple of weeks, thank you so much. Just 10 minutes before we went live, the world media delivered this pretty significant news.
According to Reuters, explosions were heard over Qatar and in the capital, Doha. And according to Axios, they're saying that they're citing Israeli officials that Iran launched 6 missiles towards US bases in Qatar. And then, according to Reuters, witnessed further explosions heard over Doha. I'm also being told that sirens are going off in Bahrain. This entire region has been on edge and on high alert. And concerns are growing that this could spread and escalate across the region. Earlier today, Qatar closed its airspace, and we now understand that 6 missiles were launched against US bases in Qatar, and that explosions have been heard over the capital, Doha.
So it seems like Iran's retaliation to America's strikes over the weekend are very much underway. It seems as if they're targeting American assets in the region, and we'll bring you updates on that developing story. I'll be asking Paul Rogers about the significance of it. Before we do that, though, let's begin by going through how we got here. And we'll start with this statement from Donald Trump on Saturday night.
A short time ago, the U.S. military carried out massive precision strikes on the 3 key nuclear facilities in the Iranian regime: Fordow, Natanz, and Esfahan. Everybody heard those names for years as they built this horribly destructive enterprise. Our objective was the destruction of Iran's nuclear enrichment capacity and a stop to the nuclear threat posed by the world's #1 state sponsor of terror. Tonight, I can report to the world that the strikes were a spectacular military success. Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated. Iran, the bully of the Middle East, must now make peace. If they do not, future attacks will be far greater and a lot easier.
That was Donald Trump calling Iran the bully of the Middle East, ignoring that it's his ally Israel that's the only country currently committing genocide in the region. Trump mentioned 3 sites the US bombed, so they were Fordow and Natanz. They're both nuclear enrichment facilities, which the US attacked with massive ordnance penetrators, or so-called bunker buster bombs, and the Isfahan Nuclear Research and Production Center, which it attacked with more than 24 Tomahawk missiles. Now, whether or not those attacks completely destroyed the facilities, as Trump suggested there in that speech remains unknown. According to US officials, it's too early to say exactly what damage was done to the site, and officials have conceded they really have no idea if Iran had already moved its stockpile of enriched uranium from the sites. It would make sense if they had done, because the United States has been telegraphing they might do this for a little while. But potentially Donald Trump saying he'll wait 2 weeks to decide was another decoy to try and get them not to move that uranium. In terms of any potential unintended effect of bombing an active nuclear site, which seems like a dangerous thing to do, doesn't it? This was somewhat reassuring. So it's from the International Atomic Energy Agency. They say following attacks on 3 nuclear sites in Iran, including Fordow, the IAEA can confirm that no increase in off-site radiation levels has been reported as of this time. The IAEA will provide further assessments on situations in Iran as more information becomes available. So it seems like there hasn't been an accidental nuclear leak, a lucky escape perhaps. So what was the purpose of the US using its bunker buster bombs on a sovereign nation? Well, this was JD Vance on Sunday.
We don't want to achieve regime change. We want to achieve the end of the Iranian nuclear program, John. That's America's objective, and that's what the president has set us out to do. The president, in the very tweet you mentioned, or the truth that you mentioned, John, said explicitly that he's not trying to take out the Iranian supreme leader. He's trying to take out their nuclear program. And of course, we took a major step forward with that last night.
That was JD Vance saying, this is not about regime change. We're doing a very targeted strike. That was repeated by Secretary of State Marco Rubio.
This mission was a very precise mission. It had 3 objectives, 3 nuclear sites. It was not an attack on Iran. It was not an attack on the Iranian people. This wasn't a regime change move. This was designed to degrade and or destroy 3 nuclear sites related to their nuclear weaponization ambitions. And that was delivered on yesterday.
So they clearly had a strategy to go out and reassure people we're not doing what happened in 2003, a disastrous regime change war. It was all for nothing, though, because Trump took to Truth Social to muddy his administration's message by posting this. It's not politically correct to use the term regime change, but if the current Iranian regime is unable to make Iran great again, why wouldn't there be regime change? And then MIGA, which is a play on MAGA. This has caused dissent among Trump's MAGA base. Obviously, Trump saying it is about regime change. This is Marjorie Taylor Greene. American troops have been killed and forever torn apart physically and mentally for regime change, foreign wars, and for military industrial-based profits. I'm sick of it. I can easily say I support nuclear-armed Israel's right to defend themselves, and also say at the same time I don't want to fight or fund nuclear-armed Israel's wars. That potentially struck a nerve because this morning Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt tried to roll back Trump's Truth Social post.
The president's posture and our military posture has not changed. The president was just simply raising a question that I think many people around the world are asking. If the Iranian regime refuses to give up their nuclear program or engage in talks, we just took out their nuclear program on Saturday night, as you all know. But if they refuse to engage in diplomacy moving forward, why shouldn't the Iranian people rise up against this brutal terrorist regime?
As for the Iranians, their president Masoud Pezeshkian responded to the attacks by saying the US, quote, must receive a response for their aggression. And he continued by saying this: we have always stated that we are ready to engage and negotiate within the framework of international law, but instead of accepting logic, the other side has demanded the surrender of the Iranian nation. The Iranian Atomic Energy Organization called the bombing of the 3 nuclear sites a, quote, barbaric violation of international law. And Iran's ambassador to the UN, Amir Saeed Iravani, said this:
once again, the internationally wanted war criminal Netanyahu succeeded in hijacking U.S. foreign policy, dragging the United States into yet another costly, baseless war. America has once more recklessly chosen to sacrifice its own security merely to safeguard Netanyahu.
So that was the Iranian ambassador to the UN accusing Trump of doing Netanyahu's dirty work. And the response from Israel didn't do much to temper those suspicions. So banners on massive billboards thanked Donald Trump, and they were spotted in Tel Aviv. They had messages saying, thank you, Mr. President, with huge pictures of his face. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was similarly gushing at a press conference over the weekend.
Congratulations, President Trump. Your bold decision to target Iran's nuclear facilities with the awesome and righteous might of the United States will change history. In Operation Rising Lion, Israel has done truly amazing things. But in tonight's action against Iran's nuclear facilities, America has been truly unsurpassed. It has done what no other country on earth could do. History will record that President Trump acted to deny the world's most dangerous regime the world's most dangerous weapons.
Keir Starmer was only slightly less gushing.
We've long had concerns about the Iranian nuclear program and been very clear that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. The US has now taken action to alleviate that threat.
Of course, alleviating threats was never really Israel or Donald Trump's priority. This afternoon, Israel widened its attacks on Tehran, targeting various sites associated with the government, like the headquarters of the Revolutionary Guards and the Evin prison. And this all, I think, suggests regime change is very much on their agenda. They're not just going for military sites, but general government sites. Iran, for their part, say more than 400 people, including 13 children, have been killed and more than 3,000 wounded. Israel reports that 24 people have been killed in Iranian strikes. As for what Iran could do in response, one option which has been much discussed is Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz, through which a quarter of the world's oil supply passes. Oil prices have surged in anticipation of that possibility. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has urged China to try and intervene and stop Tehran doing that. I don't know why they want to clean up America's mess. I suppose because they also use that oil, to be honest. And we now know what is at least one of Iran's very significant responses, which is Iran has now confirmed that they have launched a base housing US troops in... So Iran has confirmed that it has attacked US forces at an airbase in Qatar, but then also Associated Press is now reporting from just a minute ago that missiles have been launched at a base housing US troops in Iraq. They're citing a security official. To better understand exactly what's going on, I'm now joined by Emeritus Professor of Peace Studies at Bradford University, Paul Rogers. Thank you so much for joining us again, Paul. We always appreciate having you on. Let's begin with this breaking news. So Iran says it has attacked US forces at an airbase in Qatar, and missiles have apparently been launched towards US troops in Iraq. Are you surprised by this? Does this seem like, we are heading for total war now, I suppose?
I am surprised by it. I thought there would have been a pause on the Iranian side, really to get an idea of how things were going and how essentially world opinions are going. But they've hit back very quickly. And there are two very significant targets, if I may say so. If you take the first target in Qatar, this is the Al Udeid Air Base. It's a huge base. It's probably the biggest single base for the United States in the Middle East, certainly one of them. And it's one which is important in many different ways. It's important, obviously, because it's in Qatar, and Qatar has played a very significant role. It's been open to the Americans having a base there. It's also in Doha actually had representatives of a number of what will be called radical groups, including Hamas at different times. And it's played something of a role as a mediator as well, particularly in relation to Gaza, working sometimes with the Egyptians to try and get ceasefires. So basically, it looks to different groups, but Al Udeid is a very important base. The news that you just reported, I think it's from AP, you said, so probably pretty reliable, is that Iran has announced that it's actually launched missiles towards an American base in Iraq. Now, that will be a direct attempt, I suspect, to kill American troops in an area which might not have quite the same level of missile protection, anti-missile protection, as Al Udeid would have. Al Udeid would have huge protection. And one has to say that if any of those 6 Iranian missiles were to penetrate towards the base itself or into the base, that would be something which would really shake the United States military. Even the fact that they've been launched, though, shows that the war has taken frankly, a serious turn for the worse, and a much quicker turn for the worse than expected. That coupled with the suggestion that, in fact, the Fordo attack, which was so lauded by Trump just a matter of a day or so ago, may not have been quite the success that people were saying. because obviously Israel has actually staged a further raid on the Hordopa, and you wouldn't do that if, as Trump has said, everything had been obliterated. So we're in a very early stage here. All I can say is that for the moment, any attempt to rein back on this is for the birds. And we are, I think, moving into extremely dangerous times. Obviously, we're in those already by the decision of Trump to go in with Israel in what is now essentially an Israeli-American war. One has to say that across much of the Middle East, it was always seen as an American venture because Palestinians used to say, well, you know, we're getting hit by these F-16s and F-15s. They're just American planes with the Israeli markings. And that would be the attitude that we get very commonly. So where we are is that this is expanding. It's expanding quickly. I would hate to say where it will go from here because it will be extremely difficult to get Trump to pause because in some ways, this is almost his worst fear, or at least the worst fear of the people around him, because obviously Trump wanted this to be a one-off, a very big one-off, do the job, and then do no more and not expect the Iranians to respond. Well, they've done it very quickly, and they picked these two targets. They could have gone for the American, I think it's the Fifth Fleet base in Bahrain, but they've not done that. But as say, probably the most important airbase, a significant target in Iraq. And one has to say that if any American troops or personnel are killed in either of those, then Trump will come back with a major assault on Iran. So I'm sorry to say we're in extremely dangerous times now.
I'm just going to go to a few more updates. So apparently Iran state media has announced that Iran has begun its, quote, mighty and victorious response to US strikes, is what they're saying. And the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps have said Iran's message to the White House and its allies is clear and explicit. Iran will not leave any attack on its territorial integrity, sovereignty, and national security unanswered under any circumstances. Qatar, for their part, have said it reserves the right to respond directly and in accordance with international law. It has also said there are no casualties at the US Al Udeid military base in Doha, and Qatar air defences intercepted a missile attack. I suppose one reason why I found this surprising is because, sort of, as you'd said there, it still seemed like a possibility that Trump would have seen this as sort of a one-off and didn't want an all-out war with Iran. Now, I would also assume that the Iranians would like this to be a one-off and not to draw America into an all-out war with their country, because presumably there's only one way where that ends. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. But does this not seem... I mean, I feel like my assumptions have been confounded or sort of have been upset somewhat. This doesn't seem like how I was imagining this would go. Does this seem a bit suicidal from the Iranians to you?
Not necessarily, but again, very difficult to sort of sort this out. I think one thing one needs to say, I think, from the start is that as far as the Iranians are concerned, what the Americans did was totally unacceptable. I think from an Israeli perspective, what the Israelis were hoping was that the nature of those attacks on Iran on the first day, where they effectively assassinated a number of very key people, I think they may have expected that to so damage the Iranian decision-making processes or military decision-making processes that there would be pauses while the Iranians tried to work out what to do next. Well, it hasn't taken them very long in response to what the Americans have done, which suggests that in some ways, the Iranians have held themselves together more than the Israelis might have expected, and quite possibly more than the Americans might have expected as well. That suggests that there are groups within, I think, particularly the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, who really had, to some extent, planned for the possibility of something which caught everybody by surprise. Now, okay, that's a tautology, I know, but essentially what they were expecting was the unexpected, and they thought it through a bit. That's one explanation. The other explanation is this just, having had these hits on Iran, there may have been elements within the whole military system say, we've got to respond and we've got to respond quickly. And to some extent, the more hawkish elements might have got the upper hand and agreed to organize this. And as I say, I'm speculating almost as we talk, but those are the kinds of things which people are going to have to consider if they're going to try and make sense of what has happened. The wider problem, though, is that given the nature of Trump, for his own survival almost. He has to go, I'm afraid he has to go big. I think it was fair to say, and some analysts were saying this a few days ago, that what Trump is about is winning. He's about self, he's about wealth and power, it is about winning, and he does not in any sense want to be on the losing side. He assumed, it now turns out wrongly, that he would be on the winning side on this very quickly, and that basically Iran would, quote, be dealt a lesson. That does not appear to be the case, which suggests that Trump has no option but to respond and respond forcefully on this. And this is what I fear we're going to see over the next few days.
Defending yourself is suicide, or Michael is such a chauvinist. And then people sort of saying Iran has a right to defend themselves. Now, I'm certainly not saying Iran doesn't have a right to defend itself, but my assumption going into this was that Iran, and to be fair, I think up to this point, they have been fairly conservative in how they have responded to Israeli provocations. And my assumption was that they were desperate not to get into a full-blown war because of the balance of forces and the fact that their axis of resistance seems to be much less powerful than it once was. How would you imagine the United States would respond to this, if you were sort of to guess, Paul?
I would think the most likely thing they would do would be to see what they've got in terms of their own intelligence, working closely with the Israelis in terms of where all the Iranian missile facilities are, and try and hugely expand the number of strikes against the Iranian military as a whole. Particularly the Republican Guard, the Revolutionary Guard, and that I think is where they will be coming from. They have one fully equipped and fully escorted aircraft carrier already in the region. I think their second one, the Nimitz, which is en route from the South China Sea, will be there very quickly. And they have also put in a lot more military aircraft into bases across the region. I would imagine Akrotiri, the British base, is pretty busy at present because, of course, Britain is very much involved in much of this. And the idea that we are separate, we obviously, according to Starmer, were not involved in the attacks on Fordo and Natanz and the other base, but essentially we are involved in all kinds of ways. If you look at the declassified UK reports over the last 18 months, the number of cases in which more has been found out about how Britain is involved in terms of arms sales, the use of Akrotiri and the rest, it makes it very clear that Britain is involved. And certainly, if there are any American raids on Yemen again, on the Houthis, then Britain will probably be part of the bombing campaign, as we've been twice already in the past few months. So we should sort of disabuse ourselves that Britain is staying out of it. It is not. And I think that is obviously a concern that people have to recognize. And one fears there's going to be a lot of protest, well, not fear, but expect a lot of protest in Britain, which means I also would expect that the British government is going to come down even more heavily on the people who are involved in non-violent direct action, because they'll be feeling uncomfortable, the British government, that is, as to what's going on. They recognize this is unstable in terms of political views within Britain. And for Starmer, this, I think, is a serious problem. But that's a diversion. Going back to the key area, your question actually was, I'm sorry, I'm rambling. Your question was, how will the United States respond? I would guess would be the heaviest response they can against any Iranian entity which can in any way cause problems for the American military. So it'll be very much centered on the Revolutionary Guard Corps, very much centered on the military capabilities, which are almost entirely on the missile side, and that will be pretty relentless. I think that is where the Americans would go. It may not be immediate. There may be very little happening in the next 24, 48 hours. But beyond that, no, I think that is where we'll be going.
This is an interesting update, Paul. I want to see what you think of this. So according to Sky News, the US and Gulf nations in the region were reportedly given some prior knowledge before Iran launched its missiles. So that, if that's true, that could suggest that actually Iran really didn't want to kill an American service person because they didn't want to escalate this. They didn't want to draw America into a full-blown war, but they needed to sort of signal that, this was something they would consider. So it was sort of a symbolic gesture as opposed to trying to actually militarily degrade sort of US assets in the area. If that does turn out to be true, Paul, how significant do you think that would be if Iran had given the Gulf states and the Americans foresight of their plans?
Well, I, for a start, would be somewhat relieved because it indicates just that. This is a messaging process. The problem, of course, is if one of those missiles actually worked, so to speak, and, for example, hit that American camp in Iraq and killed Americans, then we're there again. But if this was something of a symbolic raid and the missiles were successfully intercepted, that may, in sense, get the Americans to hold back a bit. And that will be the case where I think people like well, certainly Starmer would be on the phone to the White House as soon as possible, urging them not to respond in the expected way. Whether they do, I don't know, because, of course, the other factor in all of this, which we're not really talking about, is what Netanyahu is doing and what he's going to do. And he is the one whose planes were attacking Fordo this morning. And he is also a major player and can influence pretty strongly how the United States acts. So, again, this is something else to factor into what is becoming a very complex situation. But as I say, just to repeat, if this has some degree of symbolism, it will depend very much on whether the United States accepts that. I would like to think so, but I'm not at all sure they will, given the nature of Trump and given the nature of the people around him at the present time.
I do want to. You touched upon it in your previous answer. You said you were rambling. You were being way too harsh on yourself. It was all very insightful and interesting. And I want to return to the point you were making, which is sort of how Keir Starmer and the Western governments in general responding to this, which is sort of pretending that Iran started it and saying Iran has to come back to the negotiating table, even though Iran was at the negotiating table when they were bombed by the Israelis and they had previously signed a deal with the United States, which was then ripped up by Donald Trump. So it seems like we're in a topsy-turvy world if you sort of take what the Western leaders are saying at face value. But from your perspective, was there any world in which Keir Starmer, and I suppose I don't mean this just in terms of his personality. I mean, when we look at Britain and France, should we ever be surprised at how, I suppose, subservient they are to US and Israel in the Middle East? Or do you think there is a possible world where Keir Starmer says, you know what, this is ridiculous. This is clearly against the law. This is clearly a war of aggression against the Iranians. Could you imagine that happening? What would happen if he were to say that?
I think, based on the behavior of the British government since this war started, I would doubt that that is possible. I think we're in a kind of a mindset in those sectors of the British government which cannot really entertain that. At the same time, I think there are huge worries about what is going on. I mean, we're in this extraordinary position of the Israelis killing and starving people and killing, potentially starving people in Gaza on virtually a daily basis. Sometimes it's hundreds a week, and that is going on relentlessly. And the government will know full well there's a large minority of the British population which is frankly getting very angry about this. It's interesting that there was this demonstration in London in support of the Palestinians on Saturday, and we don't know how many people were there. I think the Morning Star was saying 300,000. Even if there are only 250,000, my guess is if that had happened, if the American raid on Fordo and the rest had happened a couple of days before that, you would have got more like 500,000. And I suspect there will be very big demonstrations around the country in the coming week or two. So I think the government, Starmer's government, is really concerned about the fluidity of the public mood in Britain. And I think, any political analyst would say, yes, and he certainly should be. But your question was, do I see a complete change on the part of the British government? Frankly, I think it's very unlikely. Maybe something different in France, but certainly Britain, I think, is so locked into this. And of course, we have these very close relationships with the United States of a military sort. And don't forget, again, I come back to this time and again, the role of Akrotiri, a British sovereign base in Cyprus, in all of this. More and more is coming out about that, and much of it is connected directly with the war itself. So here, I do not see a change in the British government, certainly not with Starmer in charge.
Paul Rogers, thank you so much for joining us and to responding to that breaking news. You've made so much sense of what is a very chaotic situation. We're going to move on to Palestine Action in one moment. Before we do that, I just want to read you a couple more updates. So this is from the Guardian Live blog. They say Iran coordinated its strikes on US bases in Qatar with Qatari officials in advance in a bid to minimize casualties. That's according to the New York Times. They're citing 3 Iranian officials. In a statement made by Qatar's foreign ministry spokesperson, he confirmed there had been no casualties and said the base had been evacuated earlier following established security and precautionary measures given the tensions in the region. And Iran has said that the missile attack matched the number of US bombs, signaling likely desire to de-escalate. So it seems as if, and clearly, I mean, you can tell from that interview, this is a very fast-changing situation because our analysis changed as the news changed. It seems as if this was potentially Iran trying to do a like-for-like response, but with some forewarning in a bid to sort of show they had the capacity to respond and wouldn't just completely sort of roll over, but also in a bid not to escalate. Obviously, that's a relief. Obviously, they shouldn't be put in this situation where they're being bullied by the Americans and the Israelis, which they so clearly are. The UK government will ban and prescribe direct action group Palestine Action as a terror organisation. And this move comes after Palestine Action activists broke into RAF Brize Norton Airbase on Friday while riding e-scooters and sprayed 2 planes with red paint. And Palestine Action said it targeted RAF Voyager aircraft used for transport and refuelling in order to interrupt, quote, Britain's direct participation in the commission of genocide and war crimes across the Middle East. And we, of course, know that the RAF is involved in secret spy flights over Gaza for the purpose of sharing intelligence with the Israeli military via RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus. Now, in a statement to the Commons today, Home Secretary Yvette Cooper said this: I have decided to prescribe Palestine Action under Section 3 of the Terrorism Act. A draft prescription order will be laid in Parliament on Monday, the 30th of June. If passed, it will make it illegal to be a member of or invite support for Palestine Action. This decision is specific to Palestine Action and does not affect lawful protest groups and other organisations campaigning on issues around Palestine or the Middle East. The disgraceful attack on Brize Norton in the early hours of the morning on Friday the 20th of June is the latest in a long history of unacceptable criminal damage committed by Palestine Action. The UK's defence enterprise is vital to the nation's national security, and this government will not tolerate those that put that security at risk. Counter-terrorism policing are leading the criminal investigation into this attack. In response to the prescription and that statement from Yvette Cooper, Palestine Action said this: This is an unhinged reaction to a non-violent action, spraying paint in protest, the UK government arming Israel's slaughter of the Palestinian people. The real crime here is not red paint being sprayed on these war planes, but the war crimes that have been enabled by those planes because of the UK government's complicity in Israel's genocide. It also smacks of rank hypocrisy from Keir Starmer, who rightly defended protesters who broke into an RAF base in 2003 to stop US bombers heading to Iraq, with Starmer asserting that this protest is as lawful because their intention was to prevent war crimes. Now, bizarrely, you could not make this up. That is completely true. So in 2003, Keir Starmer represented one of the Fairford Five who disrupted military operations at an airbase. Now, in 2003, the group of anti-war protesters broke into RAF Fairford in Gloucestershire to sabotage US bombers before they flew to Iraq. Now, Keir Starmer at the time argued that while the actions were against the law, they were justified because they were trying to stop the planes from committing war crimes. You could not make this up. The same Keir Starmer who's going and saying, these people are terrorists and they have to be prescribed. Not only, you can imagine sort of loyally Keir Starmer, now I'm in charge, I have to say the law must be carried out and they've committed a crime. No, but he's so dogmatic now, so sort of vociferous in his support for Israel and the commission of war crimes, I suppose, that he's willing to change the law to make it tougher on the kind of people he used to defend just 20 years ago. Also, a real sort of twist to this story, Joss Richards, who was represented by Sir Keir Starmer, was cleared after a jury failed to reach a verdict. Right? So I think this is potentially what the government were terrified of, that Palestine Action might go to court and the jury say, well, of course it was criminal damage, but they were justified because they were trying to stop a genocide or trying to sort of limit a genocide. And Palestine Action went on to say this: We are teachers, nurses, students and parents who take part in non-violent actions, disrupting the private companies who are arming Israel's genocide by spray painting or entering their factory premises. It is plainly preposterous to rank us with terrorist groups like ISIS, National Action and Boko Haram, and the former police and everyone from the former Tory policing minister, Chris Philp, to the former Labour Justice Minister, Lord Faulkner, have said prescribing Palestine Action is not justified. Their statement continues with this. The Home Secretary's statement makes a series of categorically false claims which have been made by pro-Israel groups which lobbied the government to prescribe us. We have instructed lawyers who are pursuing all avenues for legal challenge. We echo the call made by world-renowned writer Sally Rooney on everyone who opposes Israel's genocide to express your support for Palestine Action and your solidarity to show how unworkable this absurd, unacceptable attack on free speech is. So the Sally Rooney argument they reference was made today in The Guardian. So she wrote an op-ed for the paper in which she called the prescription of Palestine Action an alarming curtailment of free speech. Another strong response came from Mother of the House and former Shadow Home Secretary Diane Abbott, who posted this on X. The government seems confused between protest and terrorism. To clarify, what Israel is doing is terrorism. What Palestine Action is doing is protesting it. A protest in solidarity with Palestine Action took place today in Trafalgar Square. It was moved from outside the Houses of Parliament due to police conditions. But ahead of the protest, Metropolitan Police Commissioner Mark Rowley said this in a statement. So he said, "I'm sure many people will be as shocked and frustrated as I am to see a protest taking place tomorrow in support of Palestine Action. This is an organised extremist criminal group whose prescription as terrorists is being actively considered." This makes no sense to me. Why is he... Again, we're just in this strange topsy-turvy world where the government is pretending that these people who did some criminal damage are terrorists, and the chief of the Metropolitan Police is saying anyone who disagrees with the people who did criminal damage for a very just cause, them being banned and prescribed as terrorists, is themselves outrageous and despicable, and everyone should be shot. It's crazy. Let's look at that protest, because hundreds of people turned out to protest the prescription of Palestine Action. 3 arrests were reportedly made, 2 for obstruction and 1 for a racially aggravated public order offence. Electronic Intifada journalist Asa Winstanley captured this footage, and Winstanley said riot police were, quote, very aggressive, and he witnessed assaults by police against peaceful protesters. Novara Media's Stephen Meffin was also at the protest, where he spoke to Palestine Action's Max Geller about why Keir Starmer is so keen to lump Palestine Action in with the likes of ISIS and Al-Qaeda.
Overarchingly, the government's move is in response to how effective Palestine Action has been. We have forced the permanent closure of 2 Israeli weapons factories here in the UK. We have also exposed for the entire country to see the role RAF planes are playing in this continued war on Gaza. The reason we find ourselves here today is because last Friday, we humiliated the government with our breach of an RAF facility and the vandalizing of 2 planes. We are not a terrorist group at all. We are a domestic protest movement, and no domestic protest movement has ever been prescribed before.
Now, but you wouldn't doubt that the actions of your activists on Friday were a crime, right?
Sure, but they were exposing a much bigger crime, the crime of genocide, which the RAF has been actively participating in since October of 2023. Many people have committed crimes at RAF bases over the past few decades in protest of various military action, but none of them have ever been prescribed as a terrorist group. Keir Starmer himself defended 5 of such activists and said that they shouldn't be prescribed. He's made this U-turn today, not because of the gravity of the crime, but because of his desire to protect the genocide regime in Gaza. I think anybody who cares not just about freedom of speech, but civil liberties and the right to protest in general should be deeply concerned about what's happening with Palestine Action. This has never been done before to any domestic protest movement, but it's not going to be the last time. If they come for us in the night, they'll come for you in the morning.
Stephen also spoke to Holocaust survivor Stephen Kapos, who explained what he thinks of Palestine Action.
I think a lot of people sympathize with what they do because we are all extremely frustrated at seeing continuous atrocities and genocide going on in front of our eyes. And yet, although we can demonstrate like now, it feels inadequate somehow. and we support and proud of actually the heroic action of the Palestine Action, who put their lives and their future on the line. And I think that you cannot demand heroism from everybody, but it is extremely noble when it happens.
Stephen also spoke to someone who knows all too well the impact of UK terror legislation being applied to Palestine Action activists.
My name is Claire, and I'm the mother of one of the Filton 18, Zoe Rogers. The Filton 18 are charged with taking action with Palestine Action last summer in August, and they've had the terrorism connection applied to them. So they are already experiencing the kind of repression that this new legislation will bring in. If the government proscribes Palestine Action as a terror group, we are going to see what my daughter's been experiencing multiplied 100-fold, and it's completely unacceptable, and I'm here to speak out against it.
Tell us, what has your daughter been experiencing?
So she and the Filton 18, all of them have had the full powers of the counter-terrorist police thrown at them. So they were effectively disappeared when they were arrested. They were rearrested in the middle of the night under the Terrorism Act. 10 of them were, and they were kept incommunicado for 5 days in a special terrorist detention centre. They were interrogated day and night. They were not allowed to make a single phone call to any loved one. I would not have known where they were if a Palestine Action volunteer had not told me. I was not allowed to speak to her for nearly 2 weeks, by which time she was already in prison. Others of the 18 were arrested in violent pre-dawn raids by up to 30 officers at a time. Their doors were smashed in, their loved ones were handcuffed while they raided, searched, and took away their loved ones to prison. It's absolutely horrific that is happening in Britain today.
Ash, thank you for your patience. It's been a while before I came to you. So much has happened. What are your thoughts on this prescription? I mean, I was shocked they did it. I mean, it's clearly non-violent direct action, not terrorism, under sort of any normal definition of the word.
I completely agree with you, Michael, but I'm not shocked. And I'll tell you why I'm not shocked. I think that there has been a consistent trend with Keir Starmer's government, but also the Tory government before that, to try and use various cheat codes to make sure that protesters and activists can't employ any of the protections that the law would afford them. So in particular, with criminal damage, there is a defence in law for criminal damage for if you are preventing a greater harm or a greater crime from being carried out. This is a defence which has been used by Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil protesters. It was also a defence which was deployed, if not accepted, by the individuals who tore down Edward Colston's statue in Bristol and threw it into the harbour, that there was a greater harm being done by the statue being up, so they were acting in order to prevent that harm from continuing. Similarly, quite obviously, the arguments put forward by Just Stop Oil is that by carrying out these acts of criminal damage, small scale here in the UK, they're trying to prevent the greater harm being done by climate change. Now, there's already been guidance recommended by the Attorney General's office to try and close down the scope for defendants to use those defences. So what you have is a series of cases where juries are acquitting or at least not being able to reach a verdict on the basis of this argument. And instead of our state going, well, that's the law, they go, okay, well, I guess we have to change the law or restrict people's recourse to the law. So I think that the prescription or the proposed prescription of Palestine Action is wholly in keeping with that, this idea of, okay, well, if we don't like the way in which the law is being implemented, we're going to change the law. Furthermore, there seems to be evidence that the Israeli embassy tried to pressure the Attorney General's office. This is way back in 23, before the genocide, to intervene in UK court cases involving activists, potentially also including Palestine Action as well. So this has been something that the government has been under pressure to carry out, not just from conservatives and right-wingers, and not just from right-wing newspapers and pundits, but also the Israeli embassy itself. I think that there are two more things to consider. So the first is, as I said, I think that this is part of a wider project to restrict the ability for activists and protesters to be acquitted by a jury of their peers. The second thing, which I think is important to note, is the way in which terror legislation, in my opinion, is being misused. So I think that you can draw a connection between the proposed prescription of Palestine Action, the unlawful raid carried out on journalist Asa Winstanley's home, and the seizure of his devices. Asa Winstanley, of course, is a pro-Palestine journalist. He's been investigated under terror powers, and also the court case which is going through at the moment regarding one of the members of NECAP. There is a section of the Terrorism Act which I find incredibly worrying. And I think that any functioning democracy simply shouldn't have on the statute books, which is it is not simply against the law to belong to a prescribed terrorist organization. It's not merely against the law to express support for a prescribed terror organization. It's against the law to say or do things which are deemed reckless as to whether they could cause someone else to support a prescribed terror organization. So let's use the example of Palestine Action. If Palestine Action is proscribed, I could be arrested and charged with terror offences for saying, well, I think what they did was entirely morally justified. I think it was brave. I think it was honourable. And I think that it was a small crime committed in service of preventing and drawing attention to a much greater crime, which is the crime of genocide. That's something which could see me charged with a criminal offence and even serving prison time. And what worries me about the direction of our political culture is that no journalists seem to be calling that part out. You've got a small minority of journalists who have been talking about this element, but if you listen to LBC, if you turn on the BBC, if you read most newspapers, no one is talking about the freedom of expression angle of this. Which is, if you think that what Palestine Action did, while it was against the law, it was morally justified, and you express that point of view, if it's a prescribed terror organization, you could be doing serious jail time. I haven't seen Nick Ferrari talk about it. I haven't seen Tom Swarbrick talk about it. I've not seen any of these pundits who have backed Yvette Cooper to the hilt talking about it whatsoever. And then here's the last thing, which is maybe the politics of it, which is we know that adventurous warfare, being pulled into conflict, forever wars, is highly, highly unpopular with the public. We also know that the public from years ago now overwhelmingly backed a ceasefire in Gaza. We know that the government is operating, in a manner which is shady and opaque when it comes to the reconnaissance flights that the RAF are flying out of Cyprus over Gaza. And we know also that because America is now involved in a war with Iran, that has huge implications for our own foreign policy. All these things are wildly unpopular with the public if you put it to them straight. So I think that part of what this government is doing, and this is hand in hand with the CPS and hand in hand with the Metropolitan Police, is that they're creating enemies within. And so it's about using domestic protest groups or domestic expressions of political positions, as with NECAP, and saying, you are terrorists, so you are the enemy within. So all of that attention, all of that media outrage, instead of being directed upwards at the government, is instead being directed at people who otherwise, even if people don't agree with their tactics or their symbols or their presentation, might agree with the principles and the cause underneath it all. So that's something which I find quite worrying, because I think that the use of punitive state apparatus to target enemies within in order to let governments and the sort of foreign policy establishment off the hook. That is incredibly authoritarian and should be of concern for everybody. I am disgusted by our colleagues in the media industry. Like, I really, really am utterly disgusted by them. The fact that you don't have people who are using their platforms at legacy outlets to make these connections, I think shows the fact that much of our media, its job is to be servile to power. And I'm proud of the kind of work that we've done at Novara Media. I'm especially proud of our coverage of foreign policy issues and foreign affairs. As you all know, we are currently running a fundraiser. And if our work has been helpful for you in any way, if it's been clarifying for you in any way, please go to novaramedia.com/support. We need your support more than ever. Not least because, there are people on the internet who want to put me in jail for expressing support for Palestine Action, and I need your help to pay my legal fees.
Someone says, can't they just change their name and continue? I'm really going to try to get a kind of legal expert on this week to discuss this, because I find it very confusing what can and can't be said. And, it might also be the case that there's mass civil disobedience, and it turns out that on Monday, thousands of people are willing to say, I'm support Palestine Action, and sort of dare the police what to do. I'm really, really interested to see how this develops. I mean, for the record, I think it's wrong that we have Hamas and Hezbollah as prescribed organizations, because, obviously they're a completely different. The reason it's wrong is for a different reason. Palestine Action just clearly aren't doing terrorism, right? They're doing non-violent direct action. I think Hamas have done some things which can be described as terrorism, but so is Israel, so is the IDF, right? The idea that in a international dispute, which doesn't really affect people in Britain very much. Obviously, we're implicated, but it's not like Hamas or Hezbollah are threats to anyone in Britain. The fact that people can be arrested because of what they say about Hamas or Hezbollah, but no one can be arrested for what they say about the IDF. Now, I don't think anyone should be arrested for what they say about the IDF, but if you're not arresting anyone for what they say about the IDF, you can't arrest someone for what they say about Hezbollah or Hamas. It just doesn't make any sense to me. And I agree with you, Ash. The fact that sort of journalists are so comfortable with this, I think, really draconian sort of infringement on not just the freedom of speech, but the freedom of to report, seems to me bizarre. Well, not bizarre, because as you say, it sort of makes sense, but I suppose disgraceful. Following Trump's illegal and unprovoked attack on Iran, Western politicians have pushed out a familiar line. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer said this: Iran's nuclear program is a grave threat to international security. Iran can never be allowed to develop a nuclear weapon, and the US has taken action to alleviate that threat. The situation in the Middle East remains volatile, and stability in the region is a priority. We call on Iran to return to the negotiating table and reach a diplomatic solution to end this crisis. Now, I'll repeat, that was Keir Starmer's response to America bombing Iran. The United States bombed Iran, and his response is that Iran should return to the negotiating table. Let's go to Ursula von der Leyen. Iran must never acquire the bomb. With tensions in the Middle East at a new peak, stability must be the priority, and respect for international law is critical. Now is the moment for Iran to engage in a credible diplomatic solution. The negotiating table is the only place to end this crisis. Now, again, this is after Iran was bombed by America. It was a standard line trotted out by Western leaders. I don't want to sort of pick out Starmer and von der Leyen in particular, because this was really across the board. And the problem with it is, I'm sure you've guessed by now, it's complete bullshit. So anyone with a memory longer than a goldfish will remember that Iran did, in fact, come to the negotiating table and sign a comprehensive nuclear deal with the Obama administration in 2015. Here's how the then president announced that deal.
Today, because America negotiated from a position of strength and principle, we have stopped the spread of nuclear weapons in this region. Because of this deal, the international community will be able to verify that the Islamic Republic of Iran will not develop a nuclear weapon. This deal meets every single one of the bottom lines that we established when we achieved a framework earlier this spring. Every pathway to a nuclear weapon is cut off.
The Iran nuclear deal was negotiated and agreed by Iran and all 5 members of the UN Security Council, as well as Germany. And that was in exchange for sanctions relief. And Iran agreed to eliminate its stockpile of medium-enriched uranium, cut its stockpile of low-enriched uranium by 98%, and reduce by about 2/3 the number of its gas centrifuges. Now, centrifuges are the kit needed to enrich uranium. Iran, as part of the deal, also agreed that for 15 years, uranium would only be enriched up to 3.67%. So that's obviously way below the 90% needed for weapons. And crucially, this is critical, the International Atomic Energy Agency would have regular access to all Iranian nuclear facilities to monitor compliance. Right? It was a good deal with almost universal support among the international community, and it allowed Iran to a chance to develop economically while having a civilian nuclear energy program. Right? So it was good, right? Obama was there saying, this makes sense, Iran can develop, we're safe from nuclear weapons, yada, yada, yada. One man, though, wasn't willing to go along with it. You've guessed who, Benjamin Netanyahu. He repeatedly agitated against the deal and sparred with Barack Obama, as this report from 2015 shows.
To defeat ISIS and let Iran get nuclear weapons would be to win the battle but lose the war.
Netanyahu said the deal John Kerry is negotiating would let Iran get a nuclear weapon. Iran's Foreign Minister Zarif asked about Netanyahu.
But I don't think trying to create tension and conflict helps anybody.
Netanyahu pulled out all stops, even addressing Elie Wiesel and invoking the Holocaust.
I wish I could promise you, Elie, that the lessons of history have been learned.
The alternative that the Prime Minister offers is no deal, in which case Iran will immediately begin once again pursuing its nuclear program, accelerate its nuclear program, without us having any insight into what they're doing.
Now, as we'll come to in a moment, Obama was just right there, right? History has borne that out. Netanyahu, though, had a powerful ally in American politics. Again, you've guessed it, it was Donald Trump. As a presidential candidate, he said this in September 2015.
So I've been doing deals for a long time. I've been making lots of wonderful deals, great deals. That's what I do. Never, ever, ever in my life have I seen any transaction so incompetently negotiated as our deal with Iran. And I mean never.
Now, Trump could never really explain why he didn't like the Iran deal, except for the fact it was negotiated by Obama. But despite the International Atomic Energy Agency saying it had verified that Iran was implementing all its nuclear-related commitments, in 2018, Trump left the deal and introduced crippling sanctions on Iran. And this is from a crisis group report in 2020 on the consequences for the country of those sanctions. So they say since 2017, and again, this is written in 2020, the Trump administration has continuously tightened the noose of sanctions on Iran, targeting more than 80% of the country's economy. There can be little doubt that this maximum pressure policy is inflicting considerable economic harm on Iran. Economic growth that followed the lifting of sanctions in 2016 has given way to an inflationary recession. And they go on, the Iranian currency has lost 2/3 of its value, and oil exports, which are a crucial source of government revenue, have dropped from 2.5 million barrels per day to less than 0.5 million barrels per day, despite exemptions for humanitarian trade. Human rights groups and international aid organizations operating in Iran report the adverse impacts of sanctions in areas such as medical imports, emergency relief, and refugee assistance programs. Now, this maximum pressure sanctions campaign was kind of the strictest sanctions regime ever introduced on a country. Not only was Iran sanctioned by America in the sense that sort of America wouldn't trade with them, but America would sanction any country that traded with Iran. So it was complete isolation, complete economic warfare, which was terrible for their country and society and their health. And the consequences of that in terms of nuclear proliferation or Iran's nuclear program was also very predictable. So this chart shows the number of installed centrifuges across Iran since 2011. So centrifuges, they're the spinning machines used to enrich uranium. By 2016, when the nuclear deal was signed, Iran had almost 2,000 centrifuges in operation. Once the deal was signed and in operation, they had almost none, right? So none were operating. Once the deal was ripped up, though, the number in operation rose dramatically, so to around 15,000, we believe. So it's basically what Obama suggested would happen without a deal. If you rip up the deal and isolate Iran, that will only encourage them to race towards nuclear weapons. Now, again, it's not even official they're going for nuclear weapons, but they are clearly enriching uranium beyond the level which it's needed for domestic energy production. So why were they doing it? I mean, it has been suggested the jump in the nuclear program and in the enrichment of uranium was as much about political messaging as a plan to actually build nuclear bombs. So by showing you can make nukes, in theory, you increase the incentives for the Americans to re-enter negotiations for a deal. And the director of US intelligence said this to Congress in March.
The IC continues to assess that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and Supreme Leader Khamenei has not authorized the nuclear weapons program that he suspended in 2003.
Iran was also actively engaging in negotiations with the US to, like in Obama's nuclear deal, agree to limit the enrichment of uranium in exchange for sanctions relief. In April this year, in fact, Iran and the US concluded a first round of talks on Iran's nuclear program, which both sides described as constructive. Later that month, the US said further progress had been made in a third round of nuclear talks. And by the end of May, Trump said he believed the US was close to reaching a new Iran nuclear deal, and he told Israel not to disrupt the talks. But either Trump was actively misleading the Iranians or Netanyahu was willing to ignore Trump, because on June the 13th, Israel blew up talks by bombing Iran and, get this, attempting to kill the man in charge of negotiations. So that man is named Ali Shamkhani. Israel originally announced that they had killed him, but Iran then said that he had in fact survived the attempt on his life, I think severely injured. So in short, Iran signed a deal. Trump ripped up that deal. Iran entered negotiations with Trump to sign a new deal. Then Israel bombed their chief negotiator. Then America bombed Iran. So how did the British government respond when Trump joined the Israelis in bombing Iran? Well, we've shown you Starmer's tweet. And this is who the UK government sent out onto the Laura Kuenssberg show on Sunday morning.
We support, and always have done, the prevention of the Iranian regime obtaining nuclear weapons. You're right to say we hoped and proposed a peaceful diplomatic means to do that. It was the Iranians who were not willing to go along with that.
That was Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds taking his turn to twist logic on its head in order to defend Donald Trump trashing Obama's legacy and illegally bombing a sovereign country. Ash, many things to say. I mean, gaslighting on an industrial scale, it makes you feel quite mad watching all of these people saying it was Iran that walked away from the negotiations. They have to come back to the negotiating table when they were at the negotiating table when they were bombed. I mean, also, it's kind of strange that this is kind of a long-term beef between Barack Obama and Donald Trump. And it's kind of as if all of these Labour politicians have decided that Trump was right. You know, they're all siding with Donald Trump against Barack Obama.
So the reason why Labour politicians are pretending that Iran walked away from the negotiating table and this is all Iran's fault is because we don't have a foreign policy of our own. And the space that we're trying to carve out now, which is, oh no, Mr. President, please don't make us go to war with Iran, is conditioned by the fact we're so scared of Trump's tariffs as well. So you have decades of simply hitching our entire foreign policy posture to Washington. And then when Trump comes along, and I think that, you know, there is a clear majority, an electoral majority in this country against forever wars, is that the space in which this government has to operate is very, very narrow. And that's not just the fault of Keir Starmer. That's been the case for decades and decades. And one of the worst offenders, of course, was Tony Blair. But to talk about industrial levels of gaslighting, I just want to share with you an experience that I had on Friday evening. So on Friday evening, I did a Radio 4 panel show called Any Questions. And it's basically like Question Time, except on Radio 4. And the other guests were a Labour MP called Peter Prinsley, someone employed by Chatham House called Bronwyn Maddox, and a Tory MP, formerly Theresa May's advisor, Nick Timothy. And not one of them mentioned that Israel is a nuclear power, that Israel has never signed up to non-proliferation treaties, that Israel has never allowed international inspectors to see whether or not they are developing or have developed nuclear weapons. So if you want to talk about a missing portion of the coverage and of the political discourse around it. It's that there is one country in the Middle East with nuclear weapons, one country that is currently involved in multiple hostilities and also ground invasions of its neighbors, and it's not Iran. So you've been talking about the idea that we live in this kind of topsy-turvy world. I mean, one way in which the world is topsy-turvy is that all of the things that Israel actually does, it's somehow being transferred onto Iran as a case for war and a case for regime change. Now, Israel, has been covertly developing a nuclear weapons program, for decades and decades now. I've not heard, one American politician or one British politician say, well, it's time for regime change in Tel Aviv. I think that this is really the period in which the pretense that the UK and the US believe in international law is gone for good. There is no such thing as international law anymore. It's no good invoking treaties, because while Iran, I'm sure has not necessarily been wholly transparent with international inspectors and whatever, I wouldn't expect them to be. They played ball. They said, okay, we want to lift the sanctions. We're going to do this through diplomatic means. We're going to strike an agreement with Barack Obama. If you are an ordinary Iranian and you're looking at those years between 2015 and 2018, where they were signatories to an agreement to highly, highly curtail their nuclear program, would you now at this point think that's time well spent? I think possibly no. I've always argued against nuclear proliferation. I don't like living on a planet where multiple countries have the ability to destroy the Earth many times over. However, I can't think of a better case for the nuclear deterrent than what Israel and America have done in the past week. Because I think Aaron Bassani put it best when he said they've made it very clear that sovereignty only exists insofar as you have nuclear weapons if you're not going to cleave to the Washington consensus. There's a reason why we're not invading North Korea. And so if you're an ordinary Iranian, and you may well be opposed to the theocratic regime itself, you might be looking at the bombs falling on Tabriz or on Tehran and thinking we should have really spent that time developing a nuclear weapon, because then this wouldn't be happening. So I can't think of a worse a worse series of events for nuclear non-proliferation. I think that the idea of diplomacy and agreeing treaties, particularly with America, that's out the window. No right-thinking country should think that America will abide by a treaty that you agree with it if the next president can come along and tear it up. And there's also one last thing that I want to say, which is if you want to know who's really in charge of American foreign policy, don't look to Washington, look to Tel Aviv, because Netanyahu has gotten everything that he wants. Everything that he wants. And that's the reason why he does so many press conferences and makes so many statements in English and not in Hebrew, because his audience isn't a domestic Israeli audience. His audience is an American audience, and in particular, a Washington audience. That's why there have been these signs in English popping up in Israel saying, Mr. President, finish the job. It's an appeal directly to America. And Donald Trump, unfortunately, like many American presidents before him, but I think it's particularly acute with him, has been utterly led by the nose. This adventurous war, where we don't know what's going to happen next, and it's quite possible that there'll be a long and drawn out conflict with huge repercussions for the region in general. This started out in Tel Aviv. Like it was something that Netanyahu wanted to do, and rather than seeking permission first, instead what he did was he just went for it, totally confident that Washington would come wading in behind him, and he was right. He was completely right. Again, this isn't something that you hear very much of, from Keir Starmer and David Lammy, because they've also been led by the nose by Netanyahu, particularly when it comes to their initial support for collective punishment in Gaza, cutting off food, fuel, and water to the 2 million people there. And it would be embarrassing for them now. They're in too deep. But shamefully, it's not something which is discussed in the media either, because quite frankly, most media in this country adopts as its common sense the positions of liberal Zionism.
Very well put, Ash. Let's wrap up there. We covered a lot tonight. We still have 5,300 of you watching. Great to see so much engagement. I'll just repeat one more time. If you want to help us expand this operation, get our co-host back into the same room so that we can continue to cover breaking news like this. It does give it a different element, the show. Go to novaramedia.com/support. Ash, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.